As you can see, it's a multi-government approach to what's happening here in Ontario and indeed Canada. And one of the, I'm new to being mayor. I'm like a year and a half in, so I'm still getting my feet wet, pardon the pun. But it's one of those things where one of the first sort of actions that we had as a council was we had to, as a council, each councillor sign a declaration related to water quality, and we have to annually do that. And it's a legal document, and you do it at the region as well, the region of Niagara. And it opened my eyes, and it opened council's eyes to the significant responsibility that we have as a council. To my American counterparts, how many of you as mayors and council do you have a legal document like that every year you sign on behalf of council that you reviewed it? Just show of hands. So it's one of those things where it really puts it in the forefront, and it, from my perspective, looking at the councillors, it created an awareness for them that they have a legal responsibility. And this came out of the report from the Waukesha inquiry. And so again, any American mayors here that are in the area that download that report, and it's a significant report. And even as a new mayor, that report was released, Paul, how many years ago?
2002.
So 2002, and it's still relevant, I think, today as an incoming mayor. I reviewed it and got some further ideas about how and what we need to do. So with that, we have now Tom. Tom is now going to come up. Tom Neltner. He is with the Environmental Defense Fund's Chemicals Policy Director. He is a chemical engineer and an attorney. So you have an engineer and an attorney. That's great. Lawyer and okay.
It's trouble.
That's what it is. It is trouble. With experience in chemical safety issues in the workplace, the environment, the home, and consumer products or food, Tom has worked on lead poisoning prevention at the federal, state, and local levels for more than 20 years. He has his engineering degree from the University of Cincinnati and a law degree from Indiana University. Ladies and gentlemen, Tom.
Thank you. So, you do this so well. I'll let you. There you go. It's the blue. Good morning. And I appreciate the opportunity to come up and talk. It's nice to come back to the Great Lakes. Spent many, many years in Indiana, vacationed in the Upper Peninsula, vacationed in Western Michigan, many vacations as well as Wisconsin. Great Lakes are where we usually went for vacations when you're in southern Indiana or in Ohio or Kentucky, where I'm from. And I also really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you about lead. In drinking water and generally about lead. I've worked on lead for about 20 years now. When I was in the state of Indiana, we had a commissioner who asked us, when I was at the Department of Environmental Management, who asked us, what do we do for children's environmental health? And it became clear that we really didn't think a lot about children as particularly vulnerable to health hazards. And lead moved to the top of that list. It became a priority for me doing children's environmental health advocacy, but lead has always been the top priority. And the reason is because I've seen what lead does to children. I've had my life threatened by children, fourth graders, who were lead poisoned. And what happens with lead is, you ever wonder why 6 years old is such a big mark? That before 6 years old, the lead can pass from the blood into the brain. For you or I, and I think most people here are older than 6, the blood-brain barrier is able to keep the lead out of the brain. It can do damage to our nerves and do damage elsewhere. But in the brain, it tends to keep it out. But for kids, it gets in, and there's biological terms, but I think of it as short-circuiting the part of the brain that is developing at that stage. So we worry most about children 0 to 2 because that's when the brain is developing. The blood-brain barrier is most porous, and you just cause damage at certain stages. It's different at the age that they grow. So when you're developing your higher functioning with 2-year-olds trying to get over the road rage or the rage that you see, the acting out, well, if they've got lead poisoning at that stage, they don't do that as well. So you'll see kids that are wonderful, and then all of a sudden something doesn't go right. A fourth grader I disqualified from the Pinewood Derby when I was a cub master. So he just lost it. And it's because that rage that you see. And that's what we're worried about with lead. It's the IQ points, but it's also the damage, the severe damage it can cause when it's at higher levels. Now, paint is generally the biggest source of lead in the blood. It's the biggest risk of lead poisoning to children. And I used to think that it was almost all paint, and for 20 years focused on paint as the priority until EPA asked me to serve as sort of the lead head, for lack of better terms, on a drinking water advisory group that was trying to advise it on how long-term overhaul of the lead in drinking water rule. And after 2 years of working on that rule, we came, utilities, public health, advocates of all types, we came to the conclusion that the US rule is pointed in the wrong direction. That as long as you set priorities based on 90th percentile and some basis on corrosion control, you're pointed in the wrong direction. That the priority needs to be lead service line replacement. Not, you still do corrosion control, you still do sampling, but that triggering it based on what you see on a 90th percentile is not good science. And what the scientists described it as is sort of a Russian roulette, that these lead service lines are perfectly fine, especially with orthophosphate treatment, but that if they're disturbed, and one of the examples was a large truck driving down the street. You've been in your home and you know when that large truck goes down the street and that's shaking. Well, that lead pipe is connecting up the main to your house. It's feeling that same shaking. And sometimes it releases the lead particles into the water and we don't know it. That makes it the Russian roulette that we don't know happen. Now, fortunately, it doesn't happen that often, although we really don't know because we don't sample enough to identify it. But in the United States, with 6 to 10 million lines, there's a lot of risks. So what we did in this work group is rethought the drinking water rule and said, instead of making lead service line replacement the last resort, move it to the front. Make it something that you do in a long-term measured program. It is not a crisis. It is just like all the other challenges you as mayors wrestle with. It is a program that you start now and you reassure the citizens that you've got it under control. And you do what you are doing in Montreal of managing it in the process and protecting children, protecting pregnant women in that process. So what I want to do is just walk you quickly through what we think of as rethinking lead in drinking water. So we got to realize that policy actually makes a difference. In Ontario, it was 68, what was it, 57?
59.
59, and so different communities decided long ago to get out of lead service lines. In Chicago, they mandated the use of lead service lines up to 2 inches in size until 1986 when Congress banned it. So one of the goals is always to limit lead in consumer products. If we don't put it into our homes, we don't have to worry about managing it. We're not good at managing things in homes. So the priority should always be limiting lead in consumer products. It wasn't until 2014 that we changed the definition of lead-free in fixtures, brass fixtures, from 8% lead. Can you imagine that? Since 1986 in the United States, 8% lead in brass fixtures was called lead-free. Now, I'm a chemical engineer, and 8% is not lead-free. So now we're dealing with getting it much lower. The other one is you have to watch and set goals and monitor. And then you have to manage the lead in place, an aggressive program. That's what corrosion control does. But some things are hard to manage in place. In the paint world, it's windows. Windows are really hard to manage. If you want to protect a kid from lead poisoning from paint, you replace the windows, because that's where the windows are going up and down. And you focus on low-income housing because that's where the windows are being used most often without the air conditioning and the heating and all that. So you have to remove the hard-to-manage lead. For water, that is the lead service line. You are not going to eliminate lead just by removing a lead service line. You still got lead and solder. You still got brass fixtures. However, what you're going to do is remove that Russian roulette. You're going to remove that single source of hard-to-manage lead. And we know it works. So I'm just jumping ahead. So this working group that we were on started 2 years ago. We presented it to an advisory committee. It sounds a little like your commission. And this was all before Flint. We wrote it, made all these recommendations, and now we've realized that Flint has really changed the dynamic here. And then in December, the advisory council said, do what the working group said, replace those lead service lines, make that part of the top priority instead of a last resort. And then EPA has been embraced that, and even the American Water Works Association, the professional society for the utilities, has said, we need to get these out in the long term. So how are we approaching it at the Environmental Defense Fund? And first of all, we've recognized that cities are the key. Now, a top priority, which is underwritten this whole thing, is you got to fix Flint. Flint has so messed up their water that it's going to take a significant investment to clean up the mess that was created. Second, we've realized that you've got to invest in infrastructure. And it can't just be all supported by the cities, because some cities don't have the resources to make that happen. There needs to be the federal, provincial, state support. And we also realized the critical role of local government. And in Flint and in Michigan, there was a breakdown of that, the critical role that government provides. So we've got to make sure we're vigilant. That's what your residents depend on, and that's one of the takeaway messages from Flint. So what we're trying to do is accelerate lead service line replacement while keeping all the other things moving. So first is supporting a voluntary effort until the rule is overhauled. If the rule is overhauled now, right away, and EPA is trying to get it in 2 years, it takes 3 years in the United States before it becomes effective, and then it's a long-term program. Don't wait. Let's get these lines out now. Let's start a long-term program. Let's reassure the citizens now. Let's let them know that getting these lines out will take time. And the first step is an inventory. The other one is we need to improve risk communication. In the United States, when you buy a home or you rent a flat, what you get is a document that's in pre-1978, protect your family from lead in your home. It never mentions drinking water. It never mentions lead service lines. How can one agency, EPA, only talk about lead in one half of the context? And it's because we've been so narrowly focused. We need to be clear on the risk communication. And we need to have people that are available to go into communities to respond. We also need to democratize water testing, which means just 50 samples every 3 years isn't going to cut it. What we need to do is follow the model of Montreal and use a meter that gives you immediate results in a home so you get results so people can tell now. Why should a pregnant woman have to wait for testing or have to pay for it on their own when they have important questions to ask about their home? The other one is we have to strengthen the policies. We have to overhaul EPA's lead and drinking water rule, and we also have to fix the paint world where we need to move it faster forward. Now, in the United States, a lot of our work is being followed by the lead of Montreal. Montreal is the one who's doing the best research. They're the ones that are looking at paint and pipes and asking, where is this coming from and what's the relative contribution? That paint is important, but pipes are too. It also is the one that's testing out, how do you identify lead service lines? I'm an engineer. I've worked in manufacturing of pharmaceuticals, food additives, pesticides, and I say, I am still surprised that when we don't know where the lead service lines are. And I know that that's a big challenge, and Montreal is trying to develop the technology to do it. We want to spread that around the United States because too many people don't know where it is. So we need to follow the lead of the science that's moving us forward. We need to recognize that lead is a real risk to kids and to pregnant women, and we need to understand that this is a long-term program. A crash program will likely crash and burn. And we need to make sure we start that and sustain it. Thank you.
Okay, so we have time for a Q&A, and I We've got great information that has been forthcoming, and we've got Mayor Hope in the back who's got his hand up.
One of my questions is for Paul. Do I need a microphone?
I can hear you.
I can hear you.
Everyone can hear Randy.
Everybody can hear. I'm Randy Hope. I'm the mayor of the municipality of Chatham-Kent. And my question is to Paul. Paul, I understand the whole issue around the Waukesha and what's gone on in Chatham-Kent. I mean, for those who only have 1 or 2 water treatment plants, boy, you're lucky. I have 8 water treatment plants just to deal with my community. That's how geographically big we are. But my biggest concern, and I've heard it today in both presentations, about education, communication, and doing all that good stuff. But I believe there's an element that's missing in the province of Ontario. I compliment everything we've been doing. But I want to highlight an issue is about our levels of our workers. You know, our workforce is aging, and the levels that are required for each worker to go up a certain level to be in their competencies about running a facility and that is still way predated, way back. And it doesn't even keep up with the technology that you're asking us to do in our thing. My question is, when are we going to start to derive or change the critical part of a workers' training or workers' qualification, shrink that time frame up, deal with the newer technology, and start to make sure that we don't have any more problems going into our system? Trust me, I support everything you've done. We've dealt with the lead issues. We're done with all that stuff. But my biggest fear, and I'm telling you right now, and I've said it a number of times, my biggest fear is the competencies of our workforce in the levels that are required in order to fully run a facility is way dated with the technology changes, and the time to get to the top level takes forever. And so it is going to become a big problem in the province of Ontario if we do not address the workforce. My question to you, is people looking at that? Great, all the work you're doing, but you're missing the element of workers and the technology associated to our water treatment plants now.
Yeah, I can say I think there's really sort of 3 elements to what you're talking about. One is that there's an aging workforce, and maybe we have to work with some of the training institutions, colleges, et cetera, to really promote water operation and that kind of a profession together with our municipal partners and other interested stakeholders. But from the provincial side, there's also sort of the regulatory framework that's based on, it's aging in terms of the class certification structure that's there. Are there ways that the province could look at making that system a little more fluid or a little more modern? Certainly. And we appreciate all the kind of feedback we can get on that. And then I think, what was the third element I was going to say? The third element is on the municipal side yourselves. I think you can try to figure out how to help us understand what the needs are in terms of the human resources and specifically where the points of pinch points or points of if you mention the time it takes to build that skill set up, how can we figure out together how to work to use technologies to make that either shorter or at least an equivalent sort of new skill or technology that could be equivalent to what is there in the framework right now. So we're open to all kinds of ideas and certainly communicate those with us, and we'll see what we can do. I'll pass it to our folks that deal with those issues.
Okay, got another one at the back?
Can I just
We're at Chantal. Chantal, would like to add something?
Yeah, actually, I just want to tell you about the program that we have in Quebec. In Quebec, there's 2 technical programs for water operator, and one is after we have 5 years.
There you go.
We have. Can you hear me now? We have 5 years of high school, and then there's the 6th year. There's a 6th year in one of the program and there's a school that specializes in training operator. And then we have, after high school, we have the CEGEP in Quebec, and there's a technical program. Usually when you go to university, you do 2 years of CEGEP, but there's technical programs where you do 3 years of CEGEP, and then you become a technician. And we have water and wastewater technicians that are trained in Quebec. And for us, municipality, for the new operator comes from those two schools, and they have a very thorough training. So that one thing is very interesting in Quebec, I think.
Thank you, Chantal. Over in the back.
Thank you. Mark Nolan Hill from Highland Park, Illinois, northern suburb of Chicago. I'm not a mayor. I'm a surgeon, but have been representing my city. Many years ago, the many questions I got from the parents of my pediatric patients and adult patients was about lead paint. This was many years ago. Well, nowadays, I'm not so sure how many questions you guys get, but I am just being bombarded by the parents of my pediatric patients saying, well, what's really going on in the city, and what do we need to be worried about in terms of the lead problem in the water, or if there indeed is. So my question to you is, Mayor Hope brought up a great word, and I love it. It's communication. How are you communicating with members of my profession who get an awful lot of questions about this? I'd really be curious on that answer.
So we'll go to Paul on that one first.
And you said you were a surgeon?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. With the medical profession, I mean, I mentioned my background is public health, and one of the things we did in Ontario was to tie in the medical officer of health community, which are the doctors that represent certain areas of coverage for public health issues. We tie them in very directly with every single adverse test result that goes through drinking water systems. They get a copy of it. And we worked very closely with the Office of the Chief Medical Officer of Health and host teleconferences with that community, and part of their responsibility at each local level is to communicate with doctors locally and work with the local health units to help with communication issues that are related to health questions. So to put it in reality, for example, in Toronto's case and in Thunder Bay's case recently, where they're implementing corrosion control plans, one of the roles that the province did was to really push the local water departments to work with the local health departments on communications. And we hosted teleconferences together, and they co-developed materials that went out publicly about questions and that kind of thing. So we do that on a fairly regular basis behind the scenes. And it's also embedded in the legislation.
How do the rest of you communicate your findings and plans to the medical community?
Actually, in Montreal, all the project research that we have done with the researcher, we have somebody from the health department that is with us in all those committees, and we share all the research with that person, and then she does the transmission of the information within the health department. So, and all the communication, when we decide to go forward and communicate with our citizens, we always make sure that we validate our information with her to make sure that everything is together and we have the same understanding of the priority. But she's involved in every research project that we've been performing with other researchers.
So we've been getting a lot of phone calls too, although they're not from patients, they're from members or people who are curious where EDF stands on the issues. And we tell them paint is the primary source, but water, we're now clear, is a bigger source than we had ever thought. And that if you're concerned about it, filters, pitcher-type filters are pretty effective. Faucet-type filters are really useful as well. But more importantly, they need to talk to their health professional. As a surgeon, you're probably not trained on the lead side, but you probably remember it from your days back in school.
Well, you'd be surprised. We have to get retrained because of our patients.
And that's good to hear. So we tend to work through some networks. In the United States, there's the Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Units, which is an awful name for EPA and Centers for Disease Control funded groups, universities, who are there to help doctors answer those questions and to be available for people. There's one at University of Illinois, Chicago, for you. And they're all around the country. The second one is the American Academy of Pediatrics. They have thought a lot about this. They're a great resource, and it's one that doctors trust. They're not going to call us and ask for us advice. And then the third one is there's a group called the Children's Environmental Health Network, which represents the public health side of this that is very effective on these issues. So the bottom line is you can't scare people, but you have to make them realize that they may have a problem if they don't test, that if they've got a lead service line, a filter may be the best thing until we can get it out.
Thank you for what you're doing.
All right. We got another question at the back?
Yes, Mike Layton, the City of Toronto. We've managed to get from about 65,000 lead service replacements to 35,000. But my question is to Chantal. It's very specific to the partial service replacement. And I lived through this because I changed my lead service not that long ago, a couple years ago. So the city has a contractor that does the city side. And the public is responsible for doing their side. And so, but when you get a quote from the city contractor, it is almost always twice as much as any other individual quote. So we're almost forced to dig and cut twice because we don't have our act together so that the city's contractor is actually given a fair deal to homeowners. Do you have any advice to us in how to deal with this issue when contractors are kind of playing games with homeowners? Well, we didn't want to dig our lawn up twice, but for $2,000, I certainly will.
Actually, for homeowners, they have to contract themselves. So, but we haven't seen our prices go up all that much for the city side, and we just launched. We have a new contract here to remove all the wartime houses service line. I don't know. I don't really have any advice for homeowner if the prices are going up. It's a problem that we didn't see in Montreal right now.
Sorry, it's not that the prices are going up.
Oh.
It's when you know the city's contractor is coming, you ask them for a quote for your portion so that they can replace the whole thing in one go.
Okay.
But their quote is almost always twice as much as another individual contractor will give you for the same the same work at the same time.
From what I hear, it's very complicated for contractor to coordinate the homeowner service line removal at the same time as their contract. So I don't have any numbers of if their numbers are high, but what we're going to do is that we're going to tell the citizens, we'll try to do it 2 years in advance, and tell them where we're going to change the water main and the public service line to make sure that the homeowner can have the time to get the money to do the work, but also maybe do it before we come. So I think this is going to be easier for the homeowner if they change their side before our contractor comes. Otherwise, it's a very complicated. There's so many work in the street in Montreal, and we give short delay to make sure that we don't perturb the circulation and everything. So the contractor, for them to synchronize that, it's a challenge. So we'll try to take the problem another way to help the citizens.
There's an issue underlying that, and that is how many of you bought a home or rented a home thinking that part under that drinking water line on your property was yours? Or how many of you really thought it was the utilities until it entered your house? So a lot of people don't think of this bright line, there's mine, and to draw that bright line creates the bureaucracy and the disconnects. What happened, though, in exchange if when you bought your home, you were told the truth that over time you're going to have to replace that lead service line and it's going to cost you a few $1,000s? And you could build it in to the cost. You could build it into the mortgage, so you wouldn't have to think of it as an additional investment. It's part of something we're going to have to do. Radon control would be an example in some areas. So what happens if we disclosed it? So a landlord who was going to be renting a place would have to say, you got a lead service line, and you may have lead, and now you're may have to use a filter if you've got a child. Well, that changes the dynamic. So in some ways, on that risk communication, is telling the truth at the property transfer, at that teachable moment when you're picking a home, when you're picking a flat, you can make a big difference. Because if people understood it as part of the cost of a home, it'd be a little easier.
What we're looking into two things. Getting outside on our website, all the places where there's a possibility of lead service line, we are looking into putting this information public. So everybody who would buy a house can go on the website and see whether they have a possibility of lead service line. This is one thing that we're working on. And the other thing is we're thinking, and we're looking into maybe having some kind of certificate, so when the person sell their house, they would have to have a certificate whether they have a lead service line, and also if they have cross connection for the wastewater, because in Montreal, some part of the city, we have separated sewer, one for sanitary and the other one for rainwater, and sometimes they're cross connected. So we're looking into having that certificate so that for over time, when the houses are going to be sold, the problem is going to erase by time.
The interesting, before we get to the next question over there at the back, the interesting concept is a lot of mayors might be sitting there thinking, how do we get that information out there? How do we aggregate it and get it out into the public? It's an opportunity for open data. So if any community is exploring open data, which is the release of its information that goes out to the larger coding community, and then those in the coding community pull it down and they play with it. This is an opportunity, just thinking about what's doing in Montreal, is you can take, you have that information within your level of government, and you open it to the open data community. They will map it out for you, and they'll actually be the ones to put a map together, and then you can release it publicly and go, there's where the lead houses are in the community. So it speaks to what Tom was talking about, is creating that awareness so the homeowners become aware of it as well. Question at the back?
Mike Vandersteen, Mayor of Sheboygan, Wisconsin. My question is on acceptable levels of lead. In the U.S., the EPA says that 15 parts per billion and below is acceptable. What science is there behind those numbers, and is that being reevaluated currently?
A great question. That number of 15 parts per billion and 90th percentile is based on the level at which the corrosion control system is not doing well and needs to be optimized or start replacing lead service lines. It has nothing to do with health. And while it does have everything to do with compliance, I've seen far too many cities suggest that things are safe because we're below 15. The reality is the Montreal study showed that levels at 14 maybe make it likely that a child between 2 and 5 years old is going to have an elevated blood lead level. And there's levels when it comes to children younger than that, you may have much lower levels may cause an elevated blood lead level. One of the things the working group recommended and the National Drinking Water Advisory Council recommended to EPA was to develop a household action level, which is to say that 15 is great for managing your system. But parents, health departments, have some real decisions to make. So when you have a level that if you use that water for infant formula, that child's likely to have an elevated blood lead level, you need to know it. So let's have that level so that parents get informed of a real health-based number, and that health departments be notified so they can do what they do best, which is investigate it, ask their questions, not to treat it as a crisis. So what we were asking for is this household advisory level to be released. EPA, 2 weeks ago, committed on the Hill that they would release it this year and submit it for external peer review. So hopefully we'll have a number that actually is relevant to parents so that they can make some real decisions. Because to use and to suggest that that 15 means it's safe is not based on the science or the law.
Okay, any other questions that we have of the panel? All the questions seem to be coming from the back, I guess the people at the front, yeah. Okay, so we can wrap, and when I say wrap, I'm not talking about the musical wrap, but we can wrap this up. And on behalf of the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative, I want to thank Chantal, Paul, and Tom for the knowledge exchange that we had here. And again, thank each of them for their work in creating lead-free environments in cities in the province and through Tom's work that he's doing with the fund. Thank you very much.